They said no one would believe it, loggers risking everything to save wild Mustangs trapped by a raging inferno. The horses were supposed to be gone moved off the land years ago, but there they were, a magnificent herd with a golden mare. In the lead, cornered by walls of flame that seemed to devour the Montana mountains, Roy Peterson, a man who'd spent his life cutting trees, not saving wildlife, made a decision that defied all logic. What happened next changed not just his life, but an entire community. This is a remarkable story of how a grizzled logger with a painful past formed an impossible connection with a wild mare that some say was almost supernatural. It's about courage in the face of certain defeat, about bitter enemies becoming allies, and about the moment when a horse that had never known a human touch made a choice that left hardened men in tears. Some say miracles don't exist anymore. The people of Maple Ridge know different. Quick pause before we continue. Tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. The sky above Maple Ridge, Montana burned orange and red as the sun crept above the jagged mountain ridge, casting long shadows across the valley. Roy Peterson stood at the edge of the logging site, his weathered face a map of 62 years. In these forests, a chainsaw in his hand felt like an extension of his arm. Familiar, controlled, purposeful, he'd been cutting trees in these mountains since he was 15, following his father's footsteps and his grandfather's before that, looking to be another scorcher. Nathan said, coming up beside his uncle at 35, Nathan Peterson carried himself with the same steady confidence as Roy, though his face hadn't yet earned the deep lines that marked his uncle's. Roy nodded, squinting at the horizon. Third week of this heat, grounds dry as bone. The logging crew was already dispersing across the site, the sounds of equipment warming up, breaking. The morning quiet Warren Marshall's outfit had a deadline, 3 weeks, to clear this section before moving on to the next contract. The lumber mill in Maple Ridge was hungry for product, and Warren wasn't a man who tolerated delays. Uncle Roy, Nathan's voice dropped lower. You hear about the Firewatch upgrade level 3 now? Roy confirmed, adjusting his hard hat. Crawford called last night. Alan Crawford had been fire chief in Maple Ridge for 20 years before retiring. Now he volunteered with the Firewatch committee, and his warnings carried weight. Level 3 meant conditions were prime for disaster. A carelessly tossed cigarette, a lightning strike, a spark from equipment would be all it took. Marshall wants us working double shifts to get ahead of it, Nathan said. Of course he does. Roy's tone carried years of resignation. Warren Marshall had never seen a forest fire up close, not like Roy had. As the morning progressed, the heat intensified by noon. Sweat soaked through Roy's shirt, and the crew took their lunch break in whatever patches of shade they could find. Roy sat alone on a stump, unwrapping the sandwich he'd made before dawn. From his vantage point, he could see down into the valley past the steep slopes of what locals call Thunder Valley, a narrow canyon that cut deep into the wilderness area adjacent to their logging site. Something caught his eye, a flash of movement along the far ridge. Roy reached for the binoculars he kept in his pack, adjusting the focus as he scanned the distant tree line. What you looking at? Scott Barnes, the youngest logger on the crew, dropped down nearby at 27. Scott was eager to prove himself, though his enthusiasm often outpaced his experience. Not sure, Roy muttered, then froze as the lenses captured what had caught his attention. Horses, wild horses, moving along the ridge, a dozen, maybe more. Well, I'll be damned, Roy whispered. What is it? Scott leaned closer. Roy handed him the binoculars, looked down in Thunder Valley near the western ridge. Scott adjusted the focus and let out a low whistle. Mustangs. I thought they cleared them out years ago. So did everyone else. The herd moved with practiced precision, following a striking Palomino mare whose golden coat caught the sunlight. Roy felt something stir in his chest, something he'd buried deep long ago. Someone should call the Bureau of Land Management, Scott suggested, still watching the horses. They're probably from that herd that broke loose from the holding pens last fall. Roy held out his hand for the binoculars. Give me those. He studied the horses more carefully. They didn't move like recently captured Mustangs. This was a wild herd that knew the land, navigating the difficult terrain with confidence. The lead mare, the one with the golden coat and flowing white man, moved with particular assurance, stopping occasionally to look back at the others. We should tell Marshall. Scott said, standing up. He's got that contact at BLM. Hold on, Roy replied, lowering the binoculars. Something's not right. He scanned the horizon beyond the horses, where a strange haze had started to form. At first, it looked like heat waves rising from the distant rocky outcroppings. But as Roy watched, the haze darken, solidified, his stomach tightened. Smoke, he said quietly. Scott turned sharply. Where Eagle Ridge, other side of Thunder Valley. Roy was already on his feet, packing away his half-eaten lunch. Get on the radio, tell Nathan to get everyone together. Scott hesitated. It could just be. It's not. Roy's voice cut like steel. That's a wildfire starting and those horses are right in its path. While Scott rushed to the communication station, Roy kept his eyes fixed on the distant smoke. 20 years in these forests had taught him how quickly disaster could spread. The wind direction, the bone-dry conditions, the narrow configuration of Thunder Valley itself, all the elements for a perfect firestorm were aligning. Nathan was at his side. Within minutes, the rest of the crew gathering behind him. How bad, enough winds pushing east right. Toward us eventually, but first Roy gestured toward the moving herd. Warren marshaled shoulders way through the gathering men, his expression stormy. I just got word about a fire. Tell me it's not going to shut us down. It's just starting, Roy answered calmly. But there's a herd of wild Mustangs in Thunder Valley, right in its path. Warren's face hardened. That's BLM's problem. We need to secure our equipment and prepare to evacuate. If necessary, those horses will be trapped. Roy continued, pointing toward the canyon walls. Thunder Valley narrows at the eastern end. They'll be driven right into a dead end. And what exactly do you propose we do about it? Peterson, Warren demanded. We're loggers, not horse wranglers. Nathan stepped forward. Uncle Roy is right. That canyon turns into a death trap of fire coming if those horses get pushed into the narrow end. I'm sorry about some wild horses, Warren cut in, but I got a contract to fulfill, and men to keep safe, we need to call this in and follow evacuation protocols. If ordered, the crew shifted, uncomfortably looking between Roy and Warren. Finally, Scott spoke up. What if we could help them? We got equipment, manpower. Warren laughed, though there was no humor in it. And do what herd wild Mustangs. Have any of you ever even tried working with wild horses? Silence fell over the group. Then quietly, Roy said, I have. All eyes turned to him. Even Nathan looked surprised. You. Warren's disbelief was clear long time ago. Roy's voice had dropped a little more than a whisper, his eyes distant. Before I started logging full-time. Nathan studied his uncle's face, recognizing the shadow that passed over it. There were parts of Roy's life he never talked about, gaps in the family history that remained unmentioned. Doesn't matter. Warren said firmly, we're calling this in. And following procedure, Roy turned away from the group, lifting the binoculars. Again, the smoke had already thickened, billowing upward in dark. Plumes of herd had changed direction, moving more urgently. Now the golden mare leading them eastward directly into the narrowing canyon. Those horses will die, Roy said, not turn around, burn alive, or trample against the canyon walls. It's a shame, Warren acknowledged, his tone softening slightly. But wild animals die in fires every year. It's nature's way. Roy lowered the binoculars and turned back to face the group, something in his expression made even Warren falls silent. Those aren't just wild animals, Roy said, his voice steady, but charged with emotion none of them had heard before. That's the last free herd in this part of the mountains. Once they're gone forever. Nathan stepped closer to his uncle. What are you thinking? We got the equipment, the trucks. We could create a guide path, lead them out the western end before the fire cuts it off. Warren was already shaking his head. Absolutely not. I'm not risking my men or equipment on some fool rescue mission for wild horses. They're not just horses, Roy insisted, an edge entering his voice. They're living history, part of what these mountains have always been. The radio crackled to life before Warren could respond. Scott answered it, listened intently, then turned to group fire service. Confirms Wildfire moving east through Thunder Valley. They're mobilizing, but with resources stretched thin from the clear water blaze, they're prioritizing structural protection around Maple Ridge. What about the Mustangs? Nathan asked. Scott shook his head. They didn't even know there were horses in there. Roy looked from face to face, then settled on Warren. I'm not asking you to risk your men. Just lend me a truck. I'll go myself. Don't be ridiculous. Warren scoffed. One man against a Wildfire. I'll go with him, Nathan said. Without hesitation, Warren threw up his hands. This is insanity. The fire service will handle it. You heard Scott. Roy counted their focus on the town. No one's coming for those horses. A stalemate. Maya continued. But for what happened next, a golden mare visible now to everyone without binoculars had led the herd to an outcropping. She stood there seemingly surveying the increasing smoke, the pattern of the wind, and to the astonishment of the watching men, she reared up on her hind legs, silhouetted against the smoke-stained sky, a perfect image of wild beauty and desperate defiance. Something passed across Roy's face, recognition, pain, determination. Without another word, he started walking toward the trucks. Peterson. Warren called after him. Don't you walk away from me. Roy and slowed down. Nathan followed immediately, then Scott, and after a moment's hesitation, two more of the crew joined them. Warren cursed under his breath. Where do you think you're going? Roy finally stopped and turned. I watched a herd die in a canyon fire once before, stood by, and did nothing. I'm not doing it again. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. Nathan glanced at his uncle, suddenly understanding something about the man that had always been hidden. Warren's radio crackled again. This time was Alan Crawford's voice coming through, warning you. There we got confirmation of fire is growing fast. Thunder Valley is going up. Anyone in there needs to get out now. Warren grabbed the radio. Alan, it's the wildest thing. Peterson says there's a herd of Mustangs trapped in there. A pause then. Alan's voice tighter now. How many dozen or more? Warren replied, watching Roy's face. Another pause. The cloud walker heard they were supposed to be gone. Roy stepped closer to the radio. Alan, it's Roy. They're heading east into the narrow section. Fires coming from the west. Jesus, Alan muttered. They'll be cornered. I'm going. Roy stated flatly. Need to know the fastest route to cut them off. Turn them back toward the western pasture. What? Alan shock. Carry clearly over the radio. Roy, that fire's moving fast with this wind. It's suicide. Then tell me how to do it without dying. Roy countered. Because I'm going either way. The radio fell silent for long seconds. Finally, Alan's voice returned resigned but focused. Northridge has a service road. It'll get you above the valley. If you create some kind of barrier at the eastern neck, you might turn them back. Wes Warren stared at Roy in disbelief. You can't be serious. Roy turned to the men who had followed him. I'm going. Anyone who comes does so by choice. No hard feelings to those who stay. Nathan stepped forward immediately. I'm with you. Scott nodded me 2-1 by 1-5 of the 8-man crew stepped forward. Warren looked at the three who remained then at the determination in Roy's eyes, and something in him shifted. Damn it, Peterson. He ran a hand over his face. What equipment do you need? Within 20 minutes, 2 trucks were loaded with whatever might help. Tarps, ropes, the portable water tank they use for dust control emergency flares. Roy stood with a map spread across the hood of his truck. Alan's voice coming through on the radio, guiding them on the best approach. The canyon narrows 2 miles east of your position. Alan explained, if you can reach the north ridge before the horses pass that point, you might be able to divert them. And if we can't? Nathan asked. Alan didn't answer immediately. Then you get yourselves out. No heroics, you hear me. That fire will sweep to the eastern end like a blowtorch. Roy folded the map decisively. We hear you. As the men climbed into the trucks, Elena Sanchez's battered pickup roared into the logging site. Skidding to a stop near them, the 41-year-old rancher jumped out. Her dark hair pulled back in a tight braider expression, furious. What the hell do you think you're doing, Peterson? She demanded, striding toward him. Roy's side of all the complications, Elena Sanchez, was one he hadn't anticipated. Her family's ranch bordered the national forest, and she made no secret of her disdain for both. Loggers and wild horses, which she viewed as competing for precious grazing land. Not now, Elena, Roy said firmly. There's a wildfire coming and a herd trapped in Thunder Valley. I know. She shot back. That's why I'm here. Those Mustangs break through to my land every spring. They're my problem, too. So you've come to watch them burn? Scott asked coldly. Elena's eyes flashed. I came to help you, idiot. I've got horse trailers at my ranch that could move them if we can corral them. The men stared at her in surprise. I thought you hated those Mustangs. Nathan said. I hate seeing animals suffer more. She replied, simply. Now are we going to stand here talking, or are we going to save that herd? Roy looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Once follow us up the north service road. We'll need everything you've got. As they prepared to leave, Warren approached Roy one last time. 6 hours, Peterson. If you're not back by nightfall, I'm calling in search and rescue. Roy clasped his hand briefly. Fair enough. The trucks pulled out, engines roaring, as they headed toward the service road that would take them up to the ridge overlooking Thunder Valley. In the rear view mirror, Roy could see the smoke thickening, blackening the western sky. He pressed the accelerator harder. Beside him, Nathan fidgeted with his gloves. Uncle Roy, what did you mean back there about watching a herd die? Before Roy's hands tightened on the steering wheel. For 20 years, he had never spoken of it, not to Nathan, not to anyone in Maple Ridge. Later, he said quietly, right now we focus on these horses. As they rounded the bend in the road, the valley came into full view. Below them, the western end was already obscured by smoke. Flames visible in patches where the fire found fuel, and in the middle of it all, moving with increasing panic, the Mustang herd fled eastward. The golden mare still in the lead. There they are, Scott said from the back seat, still ahead of the worst. That Roy watched the mare, her movements decisive, purposeful, and felt a strange connection, as though time was folding back on itself. She knows they're in trouble, he murmured. She's trying to save them. Can we really do this? Nathan asked quietly. Roy didn't answer immediately. The truth was he didn't know, but the image of the golden mare standing defiant against the smoke had awakened something in him that had been dormant for decades. We have to try, he finally said. The trucks continued up the winding road, racing against flame and time toward a desperate gamble that would either save a legend or end in tragedy. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The service road narrowed as it climbed, forcing the trucks to slow despite the urgency pressing down on them. Loose rocks clattered beneath their tires, dust rising behind them to mingle with the distant smoke. Roy leaned forward over the steering wheel, eyes locked on the winding path ahead, while constantly checking the valley below, where the Mustangs continued their desperate flight from the advancing flames. There, Nathan pointed to a clearing ahead where the road flattened before curving around the mountain. That's our access point. Roy brought the truck to stop. The second vehicle, pulling alongside Elena's pickup, appeared around a bend moments later, its engine straining against a steep grade. As the dust settled, Roy surveyed their position. They stood on a plateau about 300 feet above the valley floor with a steep but navigable slope leading down. "We need to move fast," Roy said, climbing out. Fires picking up speed. The crew unloaded quickly, hauling tarps, ropes, and water containers to the edge of the ridge below them. The Mustang herd had slowed, bunching together as the canyon began to narrow. The golden mare Duchess, as Scott had taken to calling her pace at the front of the group, her movements growing more agitated. "She knows they're running into a trap," Elena said, joining Roy at the ledge. "The canyon dead ends about a mile ahead, sheer rock faces on 3 sides. How do you know so much about it?" Nathan asked, sorting through coils of rope. Elena's expression hardened. "Because that's where they always hide when my ranch hands try to drive them away from our grazing land." Alan Crawford's voice crackled over the radio. Roy had clipped his belt. "Roy, you in position. Just arrived at the North Ridge. Overlook," Roy confirmed. "We can see the herd about half a mile east of us, moving toward the canyon." Pocket Fire Service update says you've got maybe 40 minutes before the fire reaches your position, Alan. Reported wind shifting your way. Roy glanced west where the smoke now billowed more thickly, occasional flashes of orange visible beneath it. Understood. Scott joined them at the ledge, looking down at the steep slope. "How we get down there without breaking our necks?" "There's a game trail." Elena pointed to a faint path zigzagging down the hillside. "My father used to hunt these ridges. It's steep, but manageable." Roy nodded, already reaching for the coils of rope. "Nathan, you and Scott take the tarps down. At first, we'll create a visual barrier to turn them back." "Elena, you said you have trailers." 3 horse trailers back at the ranch," he confirmed. "My foreman is bringing them around to the western canyon entrance. If we can drive the herd that way, then we need to make sure they have a clear path." Roy finished scanning the valley floor. "The fire's coming from the west, but there's still a gap. If we move quickly, we can funnel them through before it closes." The team worked with practice, efficiency, securing ropes to trees and beginning their descent. Roy went first, testing each section of the narrow trail before signaling the others to follow. They moved as quickly as safety allowed, aware of every passing minute as the distant flames consumed more of the forest. Halfway down, Roy paused, watching the Mustangs below. The herd had stopped moving, huddled tightly together, while Duchess and a large bay stallion ranger circled them protectively. The mare's ears flicked back, and forth, her posture alert to dangers from multiple directions. "She's trying to find another way out," Roy murmured. "Horses don't think like that." One of the loggers called down from above. Roy didn't respond, but his expression suggested otherwise. He continued down the slope, finally reaching the valley floor with Nathan close behind. "We got maybe 30 minutes," Roy said, checking his watch. "We need to stretch the tarps between those rock formations, create a barrier. They won't want to cross the men fan out across the narrowing canyon, securing the bright blue tops to create a visual blockade." Elena supervised the placement, her experience with horses proving invaluable. "Higher on the right," she called to Scott. "Horses will look for gaps, make it continuous." As they worked, the smoke grew thicker, making it harder to breathe. The crackle and roar of the approaching fire became more distinct, carrying on the wind that now blew steadily eastward, driving both flames and Mustangs toward their position. "Roy," Nathan's voice carried urgently, "they're moving again." The herd had started forward once more, Duchess leading them directly toward a makeshift barrier. Roy grabbed a water container and drenched one of the tarps, creating an improvised noise maker. By shaking it vigorously, the plastic snapped and popped, the sound echoing off the canyon walls. Duchess stopped abruptly, her head high, nostrils flaring. The rest of the herd bunched behind her, nervous energy rippling through them. "Easy," called though more to his team than the horses. "Let her see us, but don't move toward them." The golden mare poured the ground, her eyes fixed on the strange blue barrier and the human station behind it. The stallion ranger moved up beside her, his posture challenging. "They won't charge," Elenina said quietly, "but they won't turn back, either not with the fire behind them." Roy studied the mare intently. "She's looking for options." "She's a horse, Roy," Elena replied, though her tone had softened. "A smart one, but still just a horse." As if in response, Duchess Suddenly wheeled around, trotting a short distance back the way they had come. She stopped, looking expectantly at the herd, then continued a few more steps before turning again. "I'll be damned," Nathan murmured. "She's telling them to follow her." "That's not possible." One of the loggers objected. "Shut up and watch." Roy said quietly. Duchess repeated the behavior, moving westward, then stopping to look back. Several horses shifted, responding to her signal. But Ranger remained in place, his attention divided between the mare and the human barrier. "She's trying to lead them back toward the western passage," Roy said. But the stallion isn't convinced. Elena watched in disbelief. "I've worked with horses my entire life. I've never seen anything like." This the radio on Roy's bell crackled again. "Peterson, Crawford here. What's your status, Roy?" Unclipped it. Without taking his eyes off the scene, "We've established a barrier at the canyon neck. The mare is trying to turn the herd around, but they're hesitating. You need to move faster." Allen's voice was tight with urgency. "Fires jumped the ridge western passage. Is starting to close." Roy's stomach tightened. Copy. Then he turned to the team, whose faces reflected the growing tension. "We need to drive them back now, or they'll be trapped either way." "How?" Scott asked, glancing nervously at the smoke thickening behind the herd. Roy stared at Duchess, who had moved again, still trying to persuade the herd to follow, and at a moment of memory surfaced, something from the past. He'd tried to forget sound. He said suddenly they respond to sound. He grabbed a metal canteen from his pack and began striking it rhythmically against a rock, creating a steady, penetrating beat. "Spread out." He instructed the others. "Make noise, but keep it consistent. Don't spook them." The team quickly found makeshift instruments, metal tools against rock, sticks against hollow logs. The sound built slowly, creating a wall of noise that complemented their visual barrier. The effect on the herd was immediate. The horses shifted nervously, several turning to look westward in the direction Duchess had been indicating. Ranger the stallion finally moved, trotting to Duchess's side. There seemed to be a silent communication between them, a decision made without human understanding. Then, too, everyone's amazement, both horses turned and began trotting westward away from the tarp barrier. After a moment's hesitation, the rest of the herd followed. "It's working!" Nathan shouted above the noise. "Keep it up." Roy called back. "They need to move faster." The beating intensified as the team maintained their positions, watching as the Mustangs gradually picked up speed, following their leaders back toward the western canyon. Opening the smoke was thicker now, making visibility increasingly difficult. Roy wiped his stinging eyes, trying to keep sight of the golden mare at the front of the retreating herd. Peterson, Elena's voice cut through the noise. "Look." Roy turned to see what had caught her attention. A young UFO had become separated from the herd. Panicking in the smoke and confusion, it had darted behind a rock formation, away from both the herd and the humans. Without hesitation, Roy dropped his makeshift noise maker and started moving parallel to the departing Mustangs, keeping his distance, but working his way toward a stranded FO. "Uncle Roy." Nathan called after him. "What are you doing? Keep them moving." Roy shouted back, "I'll get the FO." The air grew hotter, the smoke thicker as Roy navigated the rocky terrain. He found the FO huddled against a boulder, trembling violently, its eyes wide with terror. Roy approached slowly, keeping his movements calm despite the urgency pounding in his chest. "Easy," he murmured, crouching a few feet away. "Easy there." The FO shied away, nearly stumbling on unsteady legs. Behind them, the roar of the fire grew louder, and falling ash began to swirl in the heated air. "We don't have time for gentle." Elena's voice came from behind him. She had followed a rope in her hand. "That fire's almost on us." Roy glanced back toward where the main herd was, now just a blur of movement in the smoke. "We can't leave it." "I know," Elena replied, her expression grim. "So let's do this quickly together." They worked the corner of the FO, Elena using the rope to create a barrier, while Roy edged closer. The young horse kicked and attempted to bolt twice before Roy finally managed to get close enough to grasp the FO. Fought briefly, then seemed to surrender, trembling against Roy as he lifted in his arms. "Go." Ella and Nina urged, already turning back toward their exit route. The return journey was a nightmare of heat and limited visibility. Roy struggled under the weight of the FO. The creature, surprisingly heavy despite its youth, his lungs burned with each breath of smoke-filled air, his eyes watering constantly. Elena stayed close, guiding them through the thickening haze toward where the others waited. They emerged from the smoke to find Nathan and Scott preparing to come after them. "Thank God." Nathan breathed. "We thought you were caught in it." "Nearly were." Roy gasped, still holding the trembling FO. "Where's the herd?" "Moving west," Scott reported, "but the fire's closing in from the north ridge. Now, too, we need to get out of here." Roy looked down at the FO, then back toward where the herd had disappeared in the smoke. "We need to get this one back to its mother." "There's no time," Elena insisted. We take it with us up the trail. It's our only chance. The decision was made for them as a loud crack echoed through the canyon. A burning tree crashed down across the valley. Floor 100 yards away, sending up a shower of embers. Move now. Roy ordered, still cradling the FO, to climb back up the steep trail. Was grueling Roy passed the FO to Nathan, halfway up, his arms burning with exertion. The smoke pursued them, curling around their legs like ghostly fingers trying to drag them back down. By the time they reached the plateau where their vehicles waited, all of them were coughing and gasping for breath, getting the trucks. Roy wheezed, helping Nathan place the FO in the bed of Elena's pickup. Head for the western exit. We'll try to reconnect with the herd there. As they drove down the mountain, following the winding service road, the fire crowned the trees above them, jumping from one dry pine to the next with frightening speed. Twice, they had to stop to move fallen branches from the road. The air inside the trucks grew increasingly hot, despite the air conditioning running at full blast. They're not going to make it, Scott said from the back seat, watching the flames racing alongside them. The western exit will be cut off. By now, Roy's jaw tightened. Then we make a new exit. They reached the main road that circled the valley just as the first fire trucks were arriving, sirens wailing. Alan Crawford stood beside his pickup, binoculars raised toward the burning forest. He lowered them as Roy pulled up beside him. Jesus Peterson, he said, taking in their smoke-blackened faces. You actually went in there. The herd turned back, Roy reported tersely, heading for the western passage. Did anyone see them come out? Alan shook his head. Nothing yet. Fire service says that whole section is being overrun. They're setting up a defensive line around the ranches to the south. Elena jumped down from her truck, leaving her ranch hand to watch over the FO in the bed. My foreman was bringing horse trailers to the western entrance. Has anyone heard from him? Roads are closed beyond mile marker 12. Alan informed her. No civilian vehicles allowed past the blockade. Roy stared at the billowing smoke, trying to visualize where the herd might be. There's a creek that runs to the western end, he said suddenly. Follows the property line of the Sanchez ranch. If the horses found it, they'd follow it to the south pasture. Elena finished, her eyes widening. My father built a stock gate there years ago. If it's still open, it's their only chance. Roy agreed, already turning back toward his truck. Hold on. Alan called after them. Fire service isn't letting anyone back in that direction. It's too dangerous. Those aren't just any horses, Alan. Roy said, his voice taking on that same charged quality it had earlier. That's the Cloud Walker. Heard you said it yourself. Alan's expression changed, something like recognition flickering across his features. You know about them. I know enough, Roy replied, enough to understand why they need to survive. A moment of silent communication passed between the two older men. Finally, Alan nodded. Take the county road through Shadow Creek. It loops around behind the fire line. Should get you to the south pasture of the Sanchez property. Thank you, Roy said quietly. Don't thank me yet, Alan cautioned. And Peterson, if you see the fire shifting your way, you get out no matter what. Roy didn't respond, already climbing back into his truck. Nathan slid in beside him, followed by Scott in the back seat. Elena returned to her pickup, shouting instructions to her ranch hand about caring for the FO. As they pulled away, Nathan glanced at his uncle's profile, weathered and resolute in the orange glow of the firelit sky. Uncle Roy, he said hesitantly, what did Alan mean about the Cloud Walker herd? What makes these horses so special? Roy was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as they sped toward the county highway that would take them around the burning valley. Some say they're just Mustangs. He finally answered, his voice low enough that Scott had to lean forward to hear. But the old-timers, the tribal elders from the reservation, they call them spirit horses, say they've been in these mountains since before white men came, that they disappear for years and return when the land needs them. You believe that? Scott asked skeptically. Roy's hands tightened on the steering. Well, I believe there are some things in this world we don't fully understand, some connections that run deeper than reason, like how that May knew to turn the herd around. Nathan said thoughtfully, how she tried to show them the way out. Roy nodded slowly. Duchess, that's what you called her, right? Yes, Scott confirmed, because she acts like she's in charge. A faint smile touched Roy's lips. She, as the truck sped along the winding county road, racing against time and fire toward an uncertain reunion with a herd that had already defied the odds once. That day behind them, Thunder Valley burned, orange flames leaping into the twilight sky, consuming everything in their path. And somewhere ahead of fortune favored them, a golden mare led her family through smoke and danger towards safety, guided by an instinct as old as the mountains themselves. The county road wound through rolling hills dotted with lead, juniper trees, and sagebrush, keeping them just ahead of the fire's reach. As they crested a rise, the Sanchez ranch came into view, a sprawling property with weathered wooden fences and white washed-out buildings Smoke hung over land like an ominous storm cloud tinted orange by the setting sun, and distant flames there Elena pointed from her truck, which now led the way to the south pasture backs up against the creek line. Roy followed her pickup down the gravel drive that led to the ranch house, where several vehicles were. Already parked ranch hands moved purposefully around the property, hosing down rooftops and clearing brush away from structures. An older man with silver hair and a weathered face approached. As they pulled up Hidja, "You shouldn't have come back," he said to Elena as she climbed down from her truck. Fire service says we might need to evacuate Papa. The Cloud Walker herd is trying to escape through our creek passage. She explained quickly, we need to open the south pasture gates, give them somewhere to run. The older man's expression changed. You saw them. They returned. Roy stepped forward, extending his hand. "Roy Peterson. We spotted them this morning before the fire started." Roberto Sanchez, the man, replied, shaking Roy's hand firmly. "My grandfather used to tell stories about those horses. Said they only appear in times of great change. Right now, they'll disappear forever if we don't help them." Roy said grimly, looking toward the smoke-filled horizon. "Is your south gate accessible?" Roberto nodded, turning to call out instructions to his workers in rapid Spanish. Two men immediately mounted waiting horses and rode toward the southern fence line. "They'll open all the gates between the creek and the main pasture," Roberto explained. "But how will you get the herd to come this way?" Roy looked to Elena. "This is your land. What's the best approach?" Elena consider for a moment. "The creek makes a sharp bend about a /4 mile into our property if the horses follow. If from the canyon, they'll reach that point first. We should position ourselves there. We still have the FO." Nathan reminded them, gesturing to the young horse, still huddled in the bed of Elena's pickup, now covered with a damp blanket to protect it from falling ash. "Maybe that's our advantage." Roy suggested if the mayor hears it calling, it's worth a try. Elena agreed. "We'll need to move it safely." Though the little ones exhausted within minutes, they had transferred the foal to a small horse trailer. Roy, Nathan, Scott, and Elena climbed into Roberto's ranch truck, which had a water tank mounted in the bed. Two ranch hands accompanied them on horseback as they set out across the property, following a route dirt track toward the southern boundary. The air grew thicker with smoke. As they approached the creek through breaks and haze, they could see the angry orange glow of the fire as it consumed the forest beyond the property line. The sound of it carried on the wind, a distant roar punctuated by the crack and crash of falling trees. Fires moving fast. One of the ranch hands observed nervously. "Might jump the creek if the wind picks up. That's why we need to hurry." Elena replied, her eyes scanning the tree and where the creek emerged from the forest. They reached the bend in the creek that Elena had described and positioned the trailer with the FO near the water's edge. The young horse had grown increasingly restless during the journey, nickering softly as if sensing the approach of its herd. "Now we wait," Roy said, standing beside the trailer. In hope, they found the passage minutes stretched into a tense half hour. The fire drew visibly closer, and ash fell around them like gray snow. Twice they had to douse spot fires that ignited in the dry grass nearby. The FO grew more vocal, its calls echoing across the pasture. "They should have been here by now," Scott said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "If they were coming at all." Roy didn't respond, his attention fixed on the creek line. Something in his posture suggested he was listening more than watching, tuned to some frequency the others couldn't perceive. "We need to consider pulling back," Elena said reluctantly, wiping sweat and soot from her forehead. "If the fire jumps the creek, wait." Roy interrupted, raising his hand. "Listen." They fell silent at first. There was only the omnipresent roar of the fire and the whistle of the wind. Then faintly but unmistakably came the sound of splashing water and the distinctive drumming of hooves on hard ground. "They are coming, Nathan," exclaimed Roy. Moved quickly to the foe's trailer and opened the gate, allowing the young horse to see out. While remaining contained, "Make some noise," he instructed the others. "Let them know where we are." The team spread out along the creek bend, calling and whistling while the ranch hands used their lariats to create sharp cracking sounds that carried to the smoke-filled air. The FO, sensing the commotion, began calling more insistently, its high-pitched neighs cutting through cacophony. Then, like ghosts materializing from the smoke, the first of the Mustangs appeared. A young bay mare emerged from the creek bed, followed closely by two more horses. They hesitated at the sight of humans bunching together nervously. "Stay still," Elena cautioned everyone. "Let them see the open pasture." More horses appeared, their coats darkened with sweat and soot, eyes wide with fear. They moved in a tight group, following the creek as it wound into the pasture. Nathan counted silently as they passed, his expression growing increasingly concerned. 11, he said finally, "but there were at least 15 in the canyon, And I don't see Duchess or Ranger Roy's face remain impassive, but his eyes betrayed his worry the horses that had emerged continued into the pasture, gradually spreading out as they discovered the open space and safety it offered, but their movements remained agitated, their attention repeatedly turning back toward the creek passage. They're waiting for the others. Elena observed the FO, called again, straining against the trailer gate. This time its cry was answered. A powerful neigh echoed from within these smoke moments. Later, Ranger appeared, his dark coat almost invisible against the haze, his head high and nostrils flared. He paused at the creek's edge, looking directly at the humans. Gathered there, a stance alert, but not panicked. The stallion made it. Scott breathed, but whereas as if an answer, another shape emerged beside Ranger. Duchess moved with visible exhaustion, her golden coat now gray with asher white mane matted with sweat. She stopped beside the stallion, the two of them framed against the smoke and flames behind them like figures from an ancient legend. "Thank God," Nathan murmured, but Roy's relief was short-lived. "Something's wrong," he said, studying the mayor's posture. "She's injured." Now that he mentioned it, the others could see it too. Duchess favored her right foreleg, placing it gingerly. When she moved despite her obvious pain, she continued forward, leading Ranger toward the waiting herd in the pasture beyond. "We need to help her," Roy decided, moving slowly toward the creek. "Roy, you can't approach a wild horse in that state," Elena cautioned. "She's terrified and hurt. She'll either run or fight." "She won't run," Roy replied with certainty. "She's exhausted, and she won't leave her." As Roy moved closer to the creek bank, Duchess stopped, her ears pinned back. Defensively, Ranger moved protectively to her side, pouring the ground and warning. Roy paused, maintaining a respectful distance, then slowly knelt beside the creek, keeping his posture non-threatening. "Easy," he called softly. "Easy now." The horses watched him wearily. Behind them, the glow of the fire brightened. As it reached the forest edge, a burning branch crashed into the creek 50 yards upstream, sending up a cloud of steam and sparks. "Roy, we're out of time," Elena called. "The fire's going to jump the creek any minute." Roy remained focused on Duchess, speaking in that same quiet tone. "You brought them this far. Let us help you the rest of the way." To everyone's astonishment, the mayor's ears slowly relaxed, shifting forward to catch his words. She took a tentative step toward him. Then another Ranger snorted and paced nervously, but didn't interfere. "That's it," Roy encouraged. "You know we're trying to help." The FO called again from the trailer, and Duchess's head came up sharply. She nickered in response, a sound of recognition. And relief with renewed purpose, she limped forward, crossing the creek. With Ranger following close behind, they passed within 10 feet of Roy, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from their bodies and see the intelligence in their eyes. "Incredible," Nathan whispered as the horses moved past them toward the trailer. Where the FO waited, Roy stood slowly watching as Duchess approached her, young, touching noses through the trailer's gate. The reunion was brief, but poignant, her mother assuring herself of her child's safety before turning back toward her waiting herd. "She wants us to release it," Roy called to Elenina. "Can we do that safely?" Elenina hesitated, then nodded to one of her ranch hands. The man dismounted and carefully opened the trailer gate, standing well back. As the FO burst out, the young horse immediately ran, the Duchess pressing against her side. The mare nickered, softly nudging the FO toward the waiting herd. Ranger took up position on their flank, urging them forward with gentle but insistent movements. The small family rejoined the main herd, which had gathered at the far end of the pasture. For a moment, the Mustangs formed a tight circle, touching and reassuring each other in ways that seemed almost human in their compassion. Then, as one unit, they turned and continued across the pasture toward the safety of the inner ranch lands. "They'll find water and grass in the north pasture," Elena said, watching them go. "They'll be safe there, at least now." A sudden whoosh of heat and light drew their attention back to the creek. The fire had reached the water's edge and was already sending fiery tendrils across in places. Where fallen logs created bridges of fuel. "Time to go," Roy ordered, already moving toward the truck fires. Crossing, they piled into the vehicles and began the return journey to the main ranch complex, watching the rear-view mirrors as flames began to claim the southern edge of the Sanchez property. By the time they reached the ranch house, the sky had darkened completely, the only light coming from the approaching fire and the emergency vehicles now lining the main road. Alan Crawford met them as they pulled up. His face grim. "Fire service is calling for mandatory evacuation of all ranches in this sector." He informed them, "You've got 30 minutes to grab what you can and go." Elena looked stricken. "The horses, all our livestock will help," Roy said. "Immediately, Nathan, Scott, get the rest of the crew. We'll move as many animals as we can." The next half hour passed in organized chaos. The logging crew worked alongside the ranch hands to herd cattle and horses into trailers, prioritizing the most valuable breeding stock. Elena moved through the barn like a general commanding troops, giving clear instructions despite the fear evident in her eyes. Roy found himself working beside Roberto, loading family heirlooms and photo albums into a pickup truck. The older man worked methodically, his weathered hands gentle with each memento of his family's history. Your daughter loves this land, Roy observed, carefully placing a framed wedding photograph in the truck bed. Roberto nodded. For generations of Sanchez blood and sweat in this soil, but Elena, she loves it differently, not just as property, as something alive. She helped save those wild horses today. Roy said despite everything she said about them, and he asked. Roberto smiled. Faintly, my daughter has strong opinions, but stronger heart. She fights what she fears. He glanced toward where Elenina was directing the loading of a horse trailer. Perhaps today she found something she fears more than those Mustangs losing the land itself. Roy suggested. See, Roberto agreed. And perhaps something else too. Before Roy could ask what he meant, Alan approached him, his radio crackling with urgent messages. Winds shifted. He reported fires moving northeast, now away from the ranch fire service, is holding the evacuation order as a precaution, but the immediate danger has passed. Relief washed over Roberto's face. Gracias. What about Thunder Valley? Roy asked the logging site. Allen shook his head. Gone, the entire valley burned hot, and fast marshals equipment. Whatever couldn't be moved quickly, it's all lost. Roy absorbed this news, silently thinking of Warren's face. When he learned about the financial hit, the company was insured, but the delays would be costly. Jobs might be lost, lives changed. Was it worth it? Allen asked quietly, as if reading his thoughts. Risking everything for those horses? Roy looked past him to where the rescued Mustangs could be seen in the distant pasture, the fading firelight catching their movements as they settled into their temporary sanctuary. Ask me again in a year, he replied as the immediate crisis subsided. Exhaustion caught up with everyone. The logging crew gathered near their vehicles, smoke blackened and weary. But alive, Elena approached, carrying a tray of water bottles and towels. My father insists you all stay tonight, she told them, distributing the water. We have room in the bunkhouse, and no one should be driving after what we've been through. The men accepted gratefully. Too tired to argue, Nathan took a long drink, then turned to his uncle, who stood slightly apart, his gaze fixed on the northern. Pastor, we did it, Nathan said, joining him. We actually saved them. Roy nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. For now, what does that mean? Roy sighed heavily. The weight of the day, and perhaps much more evident in the sound, those horses have no official standing, no protection. Once the fire's out and everyone moves on, they'll just be wild Mustangs again, nuisances to some, resources to others. But after what we saw today, Nathan protested how they worked together, how that mayor led them. Surely that counts on for something to us, Roy agreed, but bureaucracies don't run on wonder, nephew. They run on policies and budgets. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black SUV, its government plates visible. As it pulled into the ranch, a woman stepped out, early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and a laptop case slung over her shoulder. She approached Alan first, showing identification that caused him to straighten noticeably. Who's that? Nathan asked, watching the exchange. Trouble, Roy replied simply. Alan led the woman toward them, his expression carefully neutral. Roy, this is Dr. Tara Johnson. She's with the Bureau of Land Management, Wildlife Division, wildlife biologist. She corrected, extending her hand to Roy. I've been tracking the Mustang population in this region for the past 3 years. When I heard about a herd being spotted in Thunder Valley, I came immediately. Roy shook her hand briefly. You're too late. Valley's burnout. So I've heard. She acknowledged her, green eyes sharp with intelligence. But I'm also hearing rumors about a miraculous rescue, a herd of Mustangs saved by a logging crew. Of all things, it wasn't a miracle. Roy responded flatly. Just people doing what needed to be done. Elenina joined them, wiping her hands on a music bandana. The horses are in our north pasture, Dr. Johnson. They're safer now, but one of them is injured. The mayor, Tara's expression brightened with interest. You've observed them already. Could you identify which bloodlines they might represent? They're the Cloud Walker herd, Roy said before Elenina could respond. At least that's what the local tribal elders call. In the look of astonishment crossed Tara's face, the Cloud Walker. But they're practically a legend. There's been no documented sighting of that specific herd for almost a decade. Well, now there's been, Roy stated, 15 horses, including a distinctive Palomino mare with a white man and a bay stallion, 4 yearlings, 1 new O. Tara studied him with newfound interest. You're very observant, Mr. Peterson. Roy, he corrected, And when your life depends on reading a forest, you learn to notice details. I'd like to see them as soon as possible, Tara said, turning back to Elenina. With your permission, of course, I need to document their condition, especially that injured Mare. Elena nodded at first light. They've been through enough tonight. And it's too dangerous to approach the pasture in the dark with the fire still active nearby. Tara looked disappointed, but agreed first thing. Tomorrow, then, is there somewhere I could set my equipment? I have satellite communications gear that might be useful for fire crews. As well used to study, Elena offered it has the strongest internet connection on the property. As Tara headed toward the house with her equipment, Alan stepped closer to Roy. You didn't tell me it was a cloud Walker herd. He said, quietly, wasn't sure until I saw the mare up close. Roy replied, Helen, standing bare, described her to me once golden as sunrise. With a man like Winter Snow, Allen's eyebrows rose. You've spoken with Helen about the herd. When long time ago, Roy answered his tone, making it clear he wouldn't elaborate. Nathan, who had been listening silently, finally spoke up. Who's Helen, standing bare, tribal elder from the reservation? Allen explained, keeper the old stories, including those about the Cloud Walker horses. They're said to be descendants of the first horses brought to these mountains. Mixed with escapees from a cavalry outpost, the tribe considers them sacred, and now a BLM biologist knows they're here, Roy said grimly, which means decisions will be made about their future by people who've never looked into that mare's eyes. Dr. Johnson seems genuinely interested in their welfare. Nathan observed interest isn't the same as understanding. Roy countered to her their specimens, data points, genetic material. Not, he trailed off, unable to find the right words. Not what? Nathan pressed. Roy shook his head. Get some rest, Nathan. Tomorrow will bring its own problems. As the group dispersed toward the bunkhouse, Elena lingered behind with Roy. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the distant glow of the fire. As it continued its path away from the ranch, you know more about those horses than you're saying. Elenina finally observed the way you approached the mare, spoke to her. That wasn't your first encounter with the Cloud Walker herd, was it? Roy turned to look at her, measuring his words carefully. What do you know about the fire that burned the North Ridge 20 years ago? Elena's expression shifted as understanding dawned. That was you, the logger who tried to save the trap horses. That was me, Roy confirmed quietly, and my brother Charlie. Only, I made out I was just a girl. Then Elena said, but I remember the stories. Two men went in after a herd caught by the flames. Only one returned. Roy looked away, his profile hard against the distant firelight. Charlie believed those horses were worth saving, worth dying for. As it turned out, I didn't understand it then. He paused. I think I'm starting to now. Because of the mayor. Elena guessed because of what you saw her do today. Duchess, Roy said, a faint smile touching his lips. Scott named her. That fits her somehow. She's not just any horse. Elena agreed. The way she led the herd calculated their escape. She hesitated. My grandfather would say she is El Spiritu Antigua, the old spirit. Your father mentioned you had conflicts with wild horses in past. Roy said, changing the subject slightly. They damage your fences, compete for grazing. Elena sighed. It's complicated. This land has been in my family for generations. We've worked it, improved it, protected it. Then these horses come through like they own it, taking what they need with no regard for boundaries. Not so different from people, Roy observed. Perhaps not. Elena conceded. But today, watching that mare fight so hard to save her family, it reminded me of something my grandmother used to say. We don't truly own the land. We just borrow from those who came before and those who will come after. She looked toward the pasture where the rescued Mustangs had settled for the night. Maybe those horses have as much claim to this valley as we do. Roy studied her face in the dim light, seeing the complexity of emotions there, the rancher's practicality, wearing with a deeper appreciation for the wild beauty they had witnessed. What will you do if the BLM wants to round them up? He asked. Elena's expression hardened. They're on my land now. That buys us some time, at least us? Roy questioned, one eyebrow raised. You risked your life to save them, Peterson. Elenina replied with a hint of her usual sharpness. Don't pretend you don't care what happens next. Before Roy could respond, a shout came from the direction of the bunkhouse. Scott was running toward them, waving urgently. Come quick, he called. It's the mare. She's down. They found Duchess lying on her side in the pasture. Her breathing labored her injured leg, now visibly swollen. The rest of the herd circled nervously nearby, with Ranger standing guard a few yards away, his attention divided between the fallen mare and the humans gathering at the fence. We need Dr. Johnson, Elena said, immediately turning to Scott. Get her and my father's medical kit from the tack room. As Scott rushed off, Roy climbed the fence and dropped into the pasture. Nathan called after him. "Uncle Roy, what are you doing? That stallion will charge you." "No, he won't." Roy replied calmly, though he wasn't entirely certain of that himself. He approached slowly, speaking in a low, steady voice. As he had done at the creek, Ranger poured the ground and snorted a warning, but didn't charge. The other horses moved back, creating a space around Duchess, and the approaching human Roy knelt beside the mare, gently placing his hand on her neck. Her skin twitched at his touch, but she made no attempt to rise or pull away. Her eyes, though, glazed with pain, fixed on him with that same intelligence he had recognized before. "Easy, girl," he murmured. "We're going to help you." He carefully examined the injured leg, without moving and finding a deep laceration just above the knee, likely from barbed wire or sharp debris encountered during their escape. The wound was contaminated with dirt and ash, and heat radiated from the swollen tissue. Early signs of infection. Elena joined in, moving with the same careful deliberation. "How bad enough?" Roy answered. "She needs antibiotics proper. Cleaning, probably stitches. Can we move her to the barn?" Roy shook his head. "Not without sedation. And even then, separating her from the herd might do more harm than good." Tara Johnson arrived moments later, medical kit in hand and camera slung around her neck. She assessed the situation quickly, her professional demeanor taking over. "That's definitely our lead mare," she confirmed, kneeling to examine Duchess more closely. "Remarkable specimen. Classic Spanish Mustang phenotype with some interesting adaptation." She glanced up at Roy. "You said she was limping earlier at the creek." Crossing, Roy nodded, but she was still bearing weight. "Then this is worse." Tara opened the medical kit and began preparing an injection. "I'm going to administer antibiotics and a mild sedative so we can clean that wound properly. But you're right, we shouldn't separate her from the herd unless absolutely necessary." As she worked, Nathan approached the fence cautiously. "Uncle Roy, the other horses are getting restless indeed." The herd had begun to pace more anxiously, responding to their leader. Distressed Ranger had moved closer, his posture increasingly threatening. "Talk to them," Roy instructed Elena and Tara. "Keep your voices calm, but don't stop speaking. They need to know we're helping." The two women began murmuring reassurances as they cleaned Duchess's wound, the mare flinching occasionally, but remaining surprisingly cooperative. Roy moved slightly away, positioning himself between them and Ranger, maintaining eye contact with the stallion. "It's okay, big guy," he said steadily. "We're not taking her, just helping." For nearly an hour they worked in this strained communion, humans tending to a wild horse beneath the stars, surrounded by a herd that seemed to understand, however reluctantly, that these particular humans meant no harm. When they had finished bandaging the leg, Tara sat back on her heels. "That's the best we can do for now," she said. "The rest is up to her." Roy nodded, watching as Duchess's eyes grew heavy from the mild sedative. "She's strong. She'll fight." "Yes, she will," Tara agreed, studying him with frank curiosity. "You seem to know these horses well for someone who just encountered them today." Roy met her gaze steadily. "Some connections don't need time, Dr. Johnson, just recognition." They withdrew carefully from the pasture, leaving Duchess resting more comfortably and the herd settling around her protectively. As they walked back toward the ranch buildings, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten with the first hint of dawn. "I've been studying Mustang herds throughout the western states for years," Tara said, falling into step beside Roy, "but I've never seen one respond to humans the way these horses responded to you, especially not a lead mare." And stallion, Roy shrugged. "Maybe they're just grateful horses. Don't think in terms of gratitude." Tara countered. "Their decisions are based on instinct, learned behavior, and immediate survival needs with respect." Dr. Roy said quietly, "After what I saw today, I think there's a lot about how horses think that isn't in your textbooks." Before Tara could respond, Ella and Nina called to them from the ranch house porch. "Phone call for you, Doctor. Your supervisor." Tara excused herself and hurried toward the house. Elena watched her go, then turned to Roy with concern in her eyes. "What do you think will happen to them?" "That depends on what the BLM decides," Roy replied, "and what we're willing to do about it." Nathan joined them, handing his uncle a mug of coffee. Warren called. "The fire's contained on the eastern front, but the logging site is a complete loss. He wants us back as soon as the roads open to salvage what we can." Roy took a long drink of the hot coffee, feeling the weight of reality settling back onto his shoulders. The brief, intense connection to the rescue was fading, replaced by the practical concerns of livelihoods and obligations. "You should get some sleep first," Elena suggested. "All you. There's nothing more to be done until daylight." Roy nodded, but as Nathan and the others headed for the bunkhouse, he remained on the porch, his gaze drawn to the pasture, where 15 wild horses that by all rights should have perished in the fire, now grazed in The pre-dawn light among them, a golden mare with a white mane lay resting her head, occasionally rising to survey her family, her territory, and perhaps to acknowledge the strange twist of fate that had brought her once again into the orbit of human lives, the same twist of fate that had given Roy Peterson a second chance to understand what his brother had died trying to protect all those years ago. Dawn broke over Maple Ridge, painting the smoke-hazed sky in muted pinks and golds. Roy stood at the pasture fence watching as the Mustang herd grazed cautiously in their temporary sanctuary. Duchess had managed to rise during the night, her movement stiff but deliberate as she maintained her position. At the center of the group, the stallion Ranger patrolled the perimeter, his muscle body tense with vigilance. You haven't slept. Elena observed approaching with 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to Roy, the rich aroma of fresh coffee briefly cutting through the lingering smell of smoke. Neither have you, he replied, accepting the mug gratefully. Elena leaned against the fence beside him. Too much to do fire service. Says immediate danger has passed, but we're still under evacuation advisory. Most of the ranch hands stayed up moving stock to the north fields. Roy nodded his eyes, never leaving the horses housed. The mare, Dr. Johnson, checked her at first light. The antibiotics seemed to be working swellings down a little. Elenina studied his profile. You care about her, it wasn't questioned. But Roy answered anyway. She saved that herd led them through fire and smoke to safety, all while injured hard not to respect that kind of courage. Is that what cost your brother's life? Elenina asked gently. Trying to save horses like these? Roy's hands tightened around his mug for a moment. Elenina thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sighed, the sound heavy with memories long suppressed. Charlie always had more heart than sense. He began when the North Ridge fire broke out. We were logging the adjacent valley, spotted a herd trapped against the cliffs. Charlie insisted we try to help, said we could clear a path through the undergrowth, guide them to Riverside. Roy paused, his eyes distant. I told him it was suicide, but he went. Anyway, I followed, couldn't let him go alone. What happened, Elena prompted. When he fell silent, wind shifted, fire jumped to fire break. We've been counting on Charlie. He got separated from me, trying to drive the horses toward the river. By the time I found it was too late. Roy's voice remained steady, but his knuckles had turned white around the mug. The horses made it out, my brother. Didn't Elena place her hand gently on his arm? I'm sorry. Roy nodded, once acknowledging her sympathy without meeting her eyes. After that, I stayed away from wild horses, focused on the timber, on things I could control, until yesterday when you saw Duchess. Elena finished for him. Something about her. Roy trailed off, unable to articulate the connection. He'd felt Charlie would have liked her. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the arrival of Tara Johnson, clipboard in hand and camera hanging around her neck. She greeted them with the bright energy of someone who, despite the crisis, was exactly where she wanted to be professionally. Good morning, she called. I've been documenting the herd since sunrise. They're remarkable specimens, classic Spanish Mustang phenotypes with some unique adaptive traits. The mare's recovery is particularly impressive. Most horses with that degree of injury would still be down. She's not most horses, Roy replied. Simply. Tara nodded, her enthusiasm tempered by professional objectivity that's becoming apparent. I've submitted my initial report to the regional BLM office. They're very interested in this herd, particularly given their suspected lineage. Elena straightened. What does that mean for them? It's complicated, Tara admitted. Technically, they're unmanaged Mustangs on public lands, which puts them under BLM jurisdiction. The standard protocol will be to round them up and process them through the adoption program. Adoption, Roy repeated flatly. You mean separate them, break them, sell them off to whoever has the money? Tara frowned slightly. The adoption program has strict guidelines, Mr. Peterson. Horses are evaluated for health and temperament, and potential adopters are carefully screened. And what about the ones that don't get adopted? He pressed the older ones, or those too wild to be easily handled? Tara's hesitation told Roy everything he needed to know. Long-term holding facilities are an unfortunate necessity in wild horse management, she said finally, but I'm advocating for this particular herd to be kept intact due to their historical and genetic significance. You think your bosses will listen? Elena asked skeptically. I think they'll consider the scientific value, Tara replied, carefully, especially if I can document the behavioral complexities. I've already observed the herd dynamics, the mayor's leadership capabilities. These aren't typical patterns. Roy turned to face her fully. So they'd still be rounded up, just kept together in some government facility instead of separated. It's better than the alternative. Tara argued these horses have no legal protection on public land outside the designated wild horse areas. At least this way, they'd be safe. Safe isn't the same as free. Roy counted the conversation, halted as Nathan and Scott approached, both looking refreshed after a few hours of sleep. Warren's on his way, Nathan reported. Roads are open again He wants to meet at what's left of the logging site to assess the damage. Roy nodded, draining the last of his coffee. We should head back, thank Elena for the hospitality. Not yet, Elena said unexpectedly. I'm coming with you to the logging site, Scott asked, surprised. I need to check the eastern fence line. Anyway, she replied, fire might have damaged it. And she glanced at Roy. I think we all have a stake in what happens next. Roy understood her meaning. Immediately, the Mustang's future will be decided in the coming days, and everyone who had participated in their rescue now felt a responsibility toward them. What about the horses? He asked. My ranch hands will keep an eye on them, Elena assured him, and Dr. Johnson wants to continue her observations. Roy hesitated, looking back at the herd. Duchess had moved closer to the fence during their conversation, her intelligent eyes seeming to follow the interaction. We'll be back, he said quietly, though whether to Elena or the mayor, no one was certain. An hour later, they arrived at what remained of the logging site. The devastation was complete. Charred equipment stood like industrial skeletons among blackened tree stumps and ash-covered ground. The air still shimmered with heat in places where deep roots continued to smolder beneath the surface. Warren Marshall stood beside his truck, surveying the destruction with a grim expression when he spotted Roy and the others approaching. His face hardened further. Well, he said as they joined him, here's what heroism gets you: 2 logging skidders, a bulldozer, and about $40,000 in miscellaneous equipment. All gone. Insurance will cover most of it. Nathan pointed out insurance doesn't cover lost time, lost contracts. Warren shot back. We're 3 weeks behind schedule now, minimum. That's if we can even salvage the rest of this cut before the permit expires. Roy examined the site. Dispassionately, southeast section didn't burn as badly. We could concentrate the remaining crew there, make up some ground. Warren snorted. But what equipment and what crew? Half the men are talking about quitting, saying it's bad luck to work a burn site. They'll come around, Roy said confidently, once the smoke clears. Warren turned to face him directly. You cost me a fortune yesterday, Peterson, all for some wild horses that probably would have found their own way out anyway. They wouldn't have. Elena interjected, stepping forward. The canyon dead ends, they would have been trapped. Warren eyed her with surprise. MS Sanchez didn't expect to see you taking Peterson's side, given your usual feelings about Mustangs on your grazing lands. I'm not taking side, Elena replied coolly. I'm stating facts. Those horses would have died without intervention. Your crew helped save them and nearly got themselves killed in the process, Warren pointed out, not to mention costing me a small fortune in equipment and delays. Some things are worth more than money, Marshall, Roy said quietly. Warren laughed. Without humor, easy for you to say. It's not your business going up in smoke. He turned away, focusing on a clipboard in his hands. The insurance adjusters will be here tomorrow. I expect all of you back to work the day after salvaging what we can from the southeast quadrant. As Warren walked away to examine a partially burned loader, Alan Crawford's truck pulled into the site. The former fire chief stepped out, accompanied by an older Native American woman using a carved wooden cane for support. Despite her evident age, Roy guessed mid to late 60s, she carried herself with dignity and purpose. Helen, Roy said, no surprise in his voice. Helen, standing bare, nodded and greeting, her dark eyes taking the destruction around them before settling on Roy. When Alan told me about the cloud Walker herd, I knew I had to come see for myself. Her voice was melodic but strong, carrying the weight of authority earned over decades. They're safe, Roy assured her, at the Sanchez ranch. And now Helen turned to Elena. Thank you for sheltering them. The Cloud Walkers have always been special to my people. I didn't know their significance when we saved them, Elena admitted. I'm beginning to understand now. Helen smiled slightly. Some knowledge comes only when it's needed. She shifted her attention back to Roy. Alan tells me you led the rescue, that you recognize the Golden Mare. Roy nodded. She's hard to forget. Indeed, Helen agreed. My grandmother spoke of that bloodline coat, like sunrise man, like winter's first snow. The people's horses, she called them, not meant for bridle or saddle, but partners in their own right. The mare is injured, Roy told her, but fighting strong as she has always been, Helen said cryptically. I would like to see her if possible. Elena stepped forward. You're welcome at the ranch, Miss Standing Bear. I can take you there now. As Elena and Helen prepared to leave, Warren rejoined the group, his expression souring further at the sight of the tribal elder. More complications? He asked Roy pointedly. Helen regarded Warren calmly. The fire has cleared what needed clearing, Mr. Marshall. Sometimes the forest must burn to reveal what truly matters. Warren's mouth tightened with all due respect. Ma'am, philosophical musings don't rebuild businesses or restore livelihoods. Perhaps not, Helen conceded, but they might restore perspective. Before Warren could retort, his phone rang. He stepped away to answer it. His posture tense. Roy turned to Helen, lowering his voice. The BLM biologist wants a document. The herd study them says they're scientifically important. Helen's expression remained serene. The government has been studying our horses for generations. What they haven't learned is how to listen to them. The mayor duchess, she seems to understand more than she should. Roy ventured, feeling slightly foolish. Even as he said it, Helen nodded. Unsurprised, the old one said the Cloud Walker horses carried messages between the living and the spirit world, that they could sense things beyond human perception. She smiled at Roy's skeptical expression. Not magic, Mr. Peterson, simply awareness beyond our limited understanding. I saw her make decisions yesterday. Roy admitted calculations no horse should be able to make. Did you? Helen asked. Or did you simply recognize intelligence that has always been there, but that most humans are too blind to see? Before Roy could respond, Warren returned, his expression transformed from frustration to something like anticipation. That was a regional Forest Service director. He announced they're sending a team to evaluate the burn site tomorrow, not just for damage assessment, but for an emergency salvage permit. Salvage permit, Nathan repeated. Warren nodded, a hint of triumph in his voice. Fire-damaged timber has to be harvested quickly before beetles and rot set in their fast-tracking approval for us to clear the entire burn area, including sections that weren't in our original contract. Roy's expression darkened. Including Thunder Valley, especially Thunder Valley. Warren confirmed the fire burned Otis there. That timber needs to come out immediately. But the horses, Scott protested, they'll be returning to that area once it's safe. Warren's face hardened again. Those horses have no claim to federal land, son. They're not even supposed to be there. According to BLM management plans. Helen, standing bare, stepped forward, her voice calm, but carrying unexpected authority. The Cloud Walker herd has grazed these mountains since before your grandfather was born, Mr. Marshall. Their claim predates any paper signed in government offices. I sympathize with your cultural attachment, Miss Standing Bear. Warren replied, his tone carefully measured, but the law is clear. Undecided Mustangs on public lands fall under BLM management, and right now the priority is fire recovery and safety. So you'll take their home while they're still recovering from nearly dying in the fire that took it. Roy said flatly. Warren spread his hands in a gesture of resignation. It's not personal, Peterson. It's business. The timber industry supports half the families in Maple Ridge. You know that better than anyone. And when the BLM comes around them up, Roy pressed. That's not my concern, Warren replied. My job is to harvest timber legally and safely. What happens to some wild horses is someone else's department. Allen, who had been listening, quietly finally spoke up. The salvage operation will take time to organize, a few weeks. At least that gives us some breathing room to figure out alternatives to the herd. Like what? Nathan asked. I don't know yet, Allen admitted, but writing them off is an option, not after what they survived, not after what we did to save them. Warren shook his head. You're all getting emotionally attached to livestock. These aren't pets. They're not even domesticated animals. They're wild horses that happen to get lucky. Because some foolhardy loggers decided to play hero, they're more than that. Roy said quietly. You didn't see them up close. You didn't watch that mayor lead her family through fire and smoke, making decisions no livestock should be capable of making. Listen to yourself. Warren scoffed. You sound like you think these horses are something special, something chosen. Not chosen, Helen corrected, gently connected to the land, to each other. And sometimes when a moment calls for it to us. Warren threw up his hands in frustration. I don't have time for this. The salvage assessment team arrives tomorrow morning. I expect my crew ready to work. When they do, he leveled a hard look at Roy. That includes you, Peterson, unless you're planning to quit over some wild horses. As Warren stalked back to his truck, the remaining group exchanged concerned glances. He's right about one thing, Nathan said reluctantly. Half the town depends on timber jobs. If the mill doesn't get its supply, people will suffer. Roy acknowledged. I know. Then what do we do? Scott asked. We can't just abandon those horses. After everything, Helen, standing bare, leaned on her cane, studying the scorched valley below them. In the old days, when the people faced impossible choices, they would seek guidance from those wiser than themselves. Meaning, Allen prompted. Meaning perhaps we should ask the one who has already proven herself a leader in crisis. Helen replied cryptically. Roy understood immediately. Duchess Helen nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes. The mayor has shown wisdom beyond human expectation. Once already, perhaps she has more to teach us. Elena, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. My grandfather used to say that solutions often come from unexpected directions. Maybe instead of choosing between horses and humans, we should be looking for a path that serves both. That's a nice sentiment, Alan said. But practically speaking, Elena interrupted. I have 3,000 acres of ranch land that borders this forest land that the Cloud Walker herd has visited for generations. Roy turned to her, understanding dawning. You're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything yet, Elena cautioned. But before we accept that the only options are government roundups or losing the herd entirely, we should consider all possibilities. She glanced at Helen, including some that might bridge old divides. Helen's weather face creased in a smile. Come, Miss Sanchez, let's go see these horses you've sheltered. I believe we have much to discuss. As Elena and Helen departed, Roy remained at the edge of the burned clearing, looking out over the blackened remnants of Thunder Valley. The mountains beyond stood unchanged, ancient, and enduring despite the fire's temporary devastation. What are you thinking, Uncle Roy? Nathan asked, joining him. Roy sighed heavily. I'm thinking your father was right 20 years ago, and I was wrong. Some things are worth the risk. The horses, not just the horses, Roy replied. What they represent, something wild and free that connects us to this land, to ourselves. Nathan studied his uncle's profile, understanding for the first time the burden of guilt and regret he had carried since his father's death. So, what do we do now? Roy straightened, decision forming in his eyes. We do our jobs, we salvage the timber like Warren wants, but we also make sure those horses have a future. He turned to face Nathan and the others, and to do that we need more than just good intentions. We need a plan. Alan nodded, already pulling out his phone. I'll start making calls to conservation community, the tribal council, anyone who might have influence or resources. And I'll talk to the crew. Nathan volunteered. Make sure they understand. What's that? Stake as a group dispersed to their various tasks. Roy took one last look at the charred valley. Somewhere out there on Elena's ranch, 15 Mustangs that should have died were instead beginning a new chapter, one that had become unexpectedly intertwined with human lives and human choices, just as his brother had tried to tell him all those years ago. Golden light filtered through the barn windows as Tara Johnson carefully examined Duchess's injured leg. The mayor stood quietly in the makeshift stall, her eyes alert, but no longer showing the fear they had when first brought into the unfamiliar structure. Helen, standing bare, watched from a respectful distance, her gaze moving between the horse and the young biologist. Remarkable healing rate. Tara murmured, gently probing the wounded area. The swelling's down considerably. Whatever ancestral genetics this herd carries, they include exceptional recovery capacity. Our stories say the Cloud Walker horses could run for days without tiring. Helen offered that they could heal from wounds that would kill ordinary horses. Tara glanced up with a scientist's measured skepticism. Genetics certainly play a role in stamina and recovery rates. These horses likely developed adaptations to harsh mountain conditions over generations. Science and stories often tell the same truth in different languages. Helen replied mildly. Elena entered the barn, carrying fresh bandages, with Roy following close behind. How is she? Elena asked, improving faster than I'd have predicted. Tara answered, straightening up. I'd like to get her on antibiotics for another few days, but the wound is clean and there's no sign of infection spreading. Roy approached the stall, slowly making sure Duchess tracked his movement. The mayor nickered softly as he reached the gate, a sound of recognition, almost greeting. She remembers you, Helen observed. She remembers all of us, Roy replied. Everyone who helped her family escape the fire. Tara made a note on her clipboard. That level is specific. Recognition suggests exceptional cognitive function. Most wild horses can distinguish between humans as potential threats or non-threats, but this kind of individual recognition is unusual. I told you she was special, Roy said without taking his eyes off the mayor. Yes, you did. Tara acknowledged her scientific detachment, softening slightly, and my preliminary report to the BLM office emphasized the unique behavioral characteristics of this herd. I've recommended they be kept intact for further study, Roy repeated flatly. In captivity. Tara, Mr. Peterson, I understand your attachment to these horses, but the reality is they can't simply be released back into Thunder Valley. That area will be actively logged for months, and beyond that they'd have no protected status, at least under BLM management. They'd be alive, but not living, Roy interrupted, kept in holding pens or artificial pastures separated from the mountains. They know what's the alternative, Tara challenged. If they remain unmanaged, they'll either be rounded up eventually or face starvation as their habitat disappears. Zoe and Nina exchanged a meaningful glance with Helen before stepping forward. There might be another option. All eyes turned to her. "I've been talking with Helen," Elena continued, "and making some calls to the county assessor's office, and my attorney. The eastern section of my ranch, the part that borders Thunder Valley, includes water rights and grazing access to about 4,000 acres of mixed private and traditionally used land. Traditionally used Terra asked Helen nodded land that the Shoshonei people have historic claims to, not reservation land, but areas recognized in the Watershed Compact of 1952 as having special status for traditional activities, which includes caring for horses that have cultural significance, Elena added. According to Helen's tribal historians, the Cloud Walker herd has been moving through these mountains for at least 10 generations, understanding dawn on Roy's facial suggesting a sanctuary on your land, a managed sanctuary. Elena clarified, part conservation area, part working ranch. The horses with a protection, but remain essentially wild. Terra looked stunned. That's a significant offer, Miss Sanchez, especially given your previous position on wild horses competing with your cattle operation. Elena's expression grew unthoughtful. My grandfather used to say that the land teaches us what it needs. If we listen long enough, she glanced at Duchess. Maybe I'm finally starting to listen to Bill. Would need to approve any such arrangement, Terra cautioned, and there would be questions about precedent management plans, funding, which is why we need your help. Elena said directly, your scientific documentation of this herd's unique characteristics could help make the case. Terra hesitated, her professional caution wearing with evident personal feelings. I can provide my observations and data, but I can't advocate for specific policy outcomes that would compromise my scientific objectivity. We're not asking you to compromise anything, Roy said, just to tell the truth about what you've seen, about who these horses really are. Before Terra could respond, Nathan burst into the barn, slightly out of breath. Forest Service team is at the logging site, Warren, showing them around, talking up the salvage operation. They want everyone there for a briefing in an hour. Roy nodded grimly. Then we'd better not be late. Elena turned to Helen. Will you stay with Duchess? I should be there too. This affects my property boundaries. Of course, Helen agreed. The mayor and I have much to discuss. Her slight smile took the edge off what might otherwise have sounded strange as they prepared to leave. Terra carefully packed her equipment. I should come too. The BLM needs representation in any discussion about wildlife impact. An hour later, they gathered at the edge of the burned logging site. A Forest Service assessment team in green uniforms moved methodically through the area, taking samples and photographs. Warren stood with a gay-haired man in a pressed uniform who carried himself with bureaucratic authority. Regional Director Patterson Allen, Crawford explained quietly to Roy as they approached Career Forest Service by the book type. Warren spotted them and waved them over with forced joviality. Here, they are now, my crew chief Roy Peterson and some of the local stakeholders. Director Patterson nodded curtly. Mr. Marshall has been explaining your unorthodox activities during the fire. While I understand the humanitarian impulse to save wildlife, I must emphasize that civilian interventions during active wildfire events are extremely dangerous.